My whole career has been about telling stories, whether even before I was a journalist, when I was dancing, it was about telling stories because I so strongly believe that stories are how we learn from each other best.
That was the voice of longtime, wildly popular opinion columnist and dance critic for the Sarasota Herald Tribune, Carrie Seidman. Carrie is my guest today on the Page and Stage podcast, and as always, I'm your host, Jason Cannon. Before we get to the conversation with Carrie, I wanted to encourage you to go check out pageandstage.art. That's pageandstage.art. There, you can find not just a link to all of the previous podcast episodes, but you can also sign up for the Page and Stage newsletter. This is a newsletter I send out in your email every Friday. It has tips and tricks and encouragement and inspiration and funny stories and deep thoughts and sometimes even a cute picture of my dogs. But that comes out every Friday, and you can sign up right there at pageandstage.art. You can also click over to the online bookshop for Ibis Books, which is the publishing wing of Page and Stage, and especially important today because Carrie's book, A Place at the Table, Memories of a Life Well Fed. It's a beautiful memoir, all focused on food, and it includes a lot of family recipes. That book was just published by Ibis Books and is available over there at the bookshop. At pageandstage.art, you can also reach me directly or just email me at jason@pageandstage.art. I love to hear from you, take your questions. And if you are working on your book or memoir or play or speech, we can work together. You can reach me there for some story coaching or editing, and I would love to put that together and work with you. And finally, over there at pageandstage.art, there is a button that says support. If you feel so inclined, if you enjoy this podcast, find value in it, along with telling one other person, if you feel like making a donation or becoming a backer, you can do that by clicking support. I put this podcast out completely free. I don't put any of the content behind a paywall, and I want everyone to have access to them. So if you feel like supporting, offsetting the cost of producing the podcast, that's how you can do that. I did also want to share one other cool little thing for May. May is National Mental Health Awareness Month. So starting today with Carrie, and for the next 3 weeks, I'm doing a trilogy set of episodes, all focused on storytelling and also normalizing mental health. Carrie, as you're going to hear very soon, started a project called Facing Mental Illness. Very personal story, beautiful story, amazing work that she's doing. Next week, I'll have on Sean Daniels, who is a fellow theater artist, and he is working with the Anti-Stigma Project up at Live Tampa. He also is the founder of the Recovery Project and the playwright of The White Chip, which reflects his journey to sobriety. That play just had a wonderful run in New York, and he is focused on using storytelling to help other storytellers especially face and overcome addiction. So don't miss that episode next week. And then in 2 weeks, I'm going to have on my good friend and my partner in crime, Scott Aaron Price. As many of you know, I've written and directed a one-man show called Clowns Like Me. We're going to Off-Broadway ourselves this summer. We will have some shows at the end of May, which of course I will tell you all about. But Scott is the actor. It's his story of living with mental illness and using theater to feel seen, to tell his story, to let everyone else know that they are not alone. So he'll be my guest in a couple weeks, and that'll wrap up our trilogy of shows devoted to storytelling and normalizing mental health during National Mental Health Awareness Month. Well, that is more than enough housekeeping, so let's get to the program. My guest again, Carrie Seidman, the opinion columnist and dance critic for the Sarasota Herald Tribune. She is also the creator, writer, and host of the Facing Mental Illness newsletter and podcast, featuring stories from people with lived mental health experience. Carrie is a graduate of the Columbia University School of Journalism and an award-winning daily newspaper reporter, critic, and columnist for more than 40 years. She's previously worked for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, the Albuquerque Journal, and the Albuquerque Tribune. And as I mentioned, she is a newly published memoirist with Ibis Books. Here we go with my conversation with Carrie Seidman. I am sitting here with Carrie Seidman in her beautiful condo overlooking the bay. We were just talking about how many people mispronounce your name. You're okay with it because it happens so much, so why bother trying to fight the tidal wave? It's Carrie Seidman, but you were just telling me a story about your dad, because right now you're an opinion columnist, the Sarasota Herald Tribune, and the column is entitled Seidman Says. But you were telling me a story about your dad and how you share that title with him and where that title came from. I'd love for you to share that.
Well, my name is spelled Seidman, which phonetically should be pronounced Seidman,
Yeah.
and probably was originally pronounced Seidman. My dad's of Russian heritage, and I think it was like Zeidman or
Okay.
something like that.
Yeah.
But throughout my life, everyone pronounces it Seidman. But I grew up saying Seidman because that's how it was pronounced in my family. So I don't correct people if they say something. And my dad, who before his death was a commentator for CNBC, had a little spot on CNBC that was called Seidman Says.
Seidman Says.
It's kind of a play on Simon Says.
Right.
And so actually my current column with the Sarasota Herald Tribune is all Seidman. So whether it's Seidman or Seidman, it's all.
We've known each other for a few years now, kind of crossing paths in various ways in Sarasota. I didn't know your father was a contributor on CNBC. Was that a recent thing? Was that a career thing? Was that inspiring to you as you also went into journalism?
He was an economist and a banking expert.
Okay.
Most of his career was spent, well, he had a kind of eclectic career. He started as CPA, taking over the accounting firm that his father and his four brothers had started. But then he went into government and he served in two administrations. He served as the chief economic advisor in Gerald Ford's term. He knew Ford because they went to the same high school.
Oh, wow.
We knew the Ford kids growing up. And then he left, of course, when Jimmy Carter was elected. He was relieved of his job.
Yeah.
He went out to Arizona and was the dean of the business school at Arizona State for a couple of years. And then he went back to Washington and was the head of the FDIC.
Wow.
For 8 years during the whole savings and loan business.
Oh, what a great time to be there.
He was a one man. I mean, a very, very astute financial person. So that was, and then at the very sort of tail end of his life, he became a commentator on economics and banking.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that's it.
And now the name lives on. Seidman Says. I think a lot of listeners who are in Sarasota might know this already, but you started out as a dancer, right? Your first interest growing up, or career-wise, you had plans to become a ballerina, basically a ballet dancer, right? What got you into dance? What drew you to it? And we'll dive in deeper on this too, but how did dance then transition into becoming a writer and storyteller?
So I have four sisters. There were 6 kids in my family, 1 boy and 5 girls.
Oh, man.
We all were put into ballet class at a relatively young age. I had older sisters who were taking ballet when I was still too young to be allowed in. And so I would go and watch their classes and sort of stand in the corner and crank my feet around. And I loved it from the minute I saw it. My sister hated it and couldn't wait to stop taking lessons.
Oh, how interesting.
Meanwhile, I was like begging the teacher at 3.5 to let me into the class. So I don't know, at 4 or 5, I also started taking ballet and studied it very seriously all the way through high school and had aspirations of a professional career, which at the time really meant you graduate from high school, you go audition.
Right.
It's a young person's
Yeah.
career. You don't spend 4 years going to college when you could be dancing. And of course, my parents thought that was a terrible idea. And they really wanted me to go to school, to college. So I ended up going to college in New York thinking, well, I'll fool them. I'll do both. And that just, turned out to not be possible. So dance was definitely my first love and my first passion. And I think I was drawn to it for a number of reasons. One, I sort of had this horrible perfectionistic streak.
That goes together. Yep.
If you know anything about it. Highly disciplined.
Precise.
Very difficult.
Yeah.
And you're always reaching for perfection you will never obtain. But the other reason was I was incredible people who know me now find this hard to believe, but I was very, very shy as a child,
Huh.
and I didn't really like to speak. As a matter of fact, I had a sister who was 15 months older than I was, who would take me around everywhere and said, "Oh, this is my sister Carrie. She's shy." So, but ballet was a way that I saw to express myself,
Yeah.
to tell a story without having to use words, which
Right.
is kind of ironic given that my whole career has been about
Right. And
this.
now, yeah.
But yeah, that was part of the original draw.
So you're in New York. You think you're fooling the world.
No, pretty evident by the time I got to you.
What were you studying in New York?
Well, I was dancing. I was taking sort of, I don't think you had to declare your major till your second year or
Okay.
something like that. So I was taking actually a lot of language classes. I actually petitioned to do a major in Romance languages because I was taking French, Spanish, and Italian,
Oh
and
my
I loved
goodness.
languages. And I could spend a semester in France in high school, but they didn't have that major and they didn't approve for me to do it. So it came to the point where I had to declare a major. And so I looked at all the credits I had and went, wow, I have a lot of English credits because I love to read. And my family's a huge family of readers. So I had the most English credits. And I thought, well, writing came easily to me. I love to read. That seemed like the logical choice. So I got a degree in English.
Yeah, even the writing, it eventually you overcame the shyness, as it were, but even writing was a way to communicate without necessarily having to speak
Yes,
publicly.
you notice I did not go into television
Right,
training.
exactly. Right. This is just kind of a out there question in terms of the vocabulary of dance and how that translates inside Carrie into telling a story physically, three-dimensionally with your body, and then into writing. Have you found that there's is there any sort of similar process or any sort of intersection between how you interpret a dance or try to communicate that way with what you do as a writer? Is there any sort of overlap? Is it different channels?
I mean, I'm sure there's some crossover. I really never have thought about it
Yeah.
that way because my dancing didn't really end. I continued to dance, but I ended up going for a master's in journalism and really being very focused on that. And it's a different process. I mean, dance, I was very drawn as a young person to the story ballets, to the
Yeah.
traditional classical story ballets. Of
Yeah.
course, there's a lot of pantomime in those, and there's that idea of how do I get this across, and how do I move someone without saying it.
Right.
And I guess you could say in the writing process, you're thinking, how do I get this across? How do I move someone with my choice of words,
Yeah.
my choice of structure, and so forth? So I'm sure that there are, similar processes, but they're quite different.
Yeah. The manifestation of them totally different. So journalism, and this is interesting too. One of your first journalistic jobs was sports writing, and this is not, man. It's always age is always tricky, but you were breaking into sports writing at a time when there were not a lot of women sports writers.
I have to go back just a tiny bit for you to understand why I became a sports writer.
Please, yeah.
So I had a boyfriend all through high school and college who was a total sports fanatic. But he was also really into especially baseball and basketball. And he went to Harvard, so I ended up spending a lot of time in Boston and seeing Celtics games and at Fenway Park and, that kind of thing. So I was just kind of immersed in it.
Yeah.
Plus my father was very athletic and, we all grew up playing tennis and sailing and just all kinds of horseback riding, all kinds of activities. So when I graduated from college with this English degree, which I really had no idea what to do, English degree was pretty worthless. He graduated the year before I did, but he didn't. He had also an English degree. Neither one of us really knew what we were going to do. Although he did aspire to be a writer,
Okay.
I really didn't. So we both applied to the journalism school at Columbia University, and unfortunately, I got in and he did.
Or fortunately, at the time.
Not fortunate for that relationship.
Yes.
So anyway, that was only a year program to get a master's degree.
Wow.
And by the time that I graduated, I had been offered a position with a paper out in Los Angeles called the Herald Examiner. I went originally as just a general assignment reporter, but they had a staff of about, trying to remember how many guys were in the sports department. I think there were about 8 or 9. It
Wow.
was back at the
Yeah.
time when papers had a lot more staff to begin with,
Yeah.
and certainly that was a big sports town. So there was a sports editor who was open to letting me, do some sports stuff. And I eventually became the first female sports writer they'd had at that paper.
Wow.
And everybody tends to say, oh, how horrible was it? We're just treated awfully. And I have to say to all those guys who were my colleagues at the Herald Examiner, they were fantastic to me. They were so wonderful to me. And I was given so many opportunities to cover things that really I didn't have the experience to cover. I, in some cases, didn't even have the knowledge to cover, but I was, I covered all of the women's sports. And this was back at a time when usually UCLA women's basketball, maybe there'd be 30 people in the audience.
Right.
Not like it was today.
Yeah.
But I covered horse racing and I covered soccer and I covered tennis. So it was a great introduction to my journalism career. And I ended up spending 3 years at that paper and then being hired by the New York Times,
Oh, wow.
which had just hired its first female sports editor,
Wow.
which is probably why I was hired in the first place.
Yeah.
And in New York, I covered NBA basketball. So
Wow.
that was more of the shock part. That was more difficult, both because it was obviously a very high profile paper, a very demanding job,
Yeah.
but also I was traveling with a team of men. All of the other sports writers were men. The fact that I was female often affected what information I couldn't give to.
Right.
So yeah, there were some challenges. And, a couple of times that I was kept out of the locker room, which the New York Times did not tolerate well.
So when you were first starting to cover sports in LA, I mean, some of these sports you maybe didn't even know the rules. I mean, what was your process to like get up to speed on a sport? And then second follow-up question is, was that sports reporting, how interpretive was that? Were there characters involved? The narrative, was it more just factual based, or were you also trying to entertain in the retelling of the event?
Well, it depends on whether it's covering a game or whether I was doing a sports feature.
Okay.
I mean, there's no question that my game coverage was not. My forte has always been writing
Yeah.
longer pieces, more magazine style pieces. And in that, writing a sports story is really no different than that. You're writing about people and how they work and how their minds work and
Yeah.
how so interviewing a sports person and doing a feature on a sports person wasn't a whole lot different than doing any other kind of feature, to me anyway,
Hmm.
because I thought the most interesting thing about them was always kind of what makes them tick, not, how they played last night.
Yeah. You eventually then pivoted into opinion. Well, no, then you became a reviewer of dance. You went from just reporting to reviewing. Is that correct? Or I know I'm skipping through years really fast here, but I want to hit
I mean, there was a whole period where I had left journalism for a while and opened a ballet studio. I've had what one person interviewing once called an eclectic career.
Hey, that's great.
So yeah, I left journalism for like 10 years and moved to Montana, got married, had my son, opened a ballet studio, taught a lot of wonderful kids, and then eventually moved to New Mexico where I had family after my divorce,
Hmm.
and went back to working for the paper in Albuquerque. And I was doing largely feature writing at that point. They also had a women's magazine, so I wrote for that. I did some travel stories. That's where I started getting pretty diverse in what I was writing. I became a restaurant critic.
Right.
I
Yeah.
wore a lot of different hats. Yeah, I eventually wrote a food column that was called A Place at the Table, which, as you know,
Yep.
became the book of essays that I recently released. So yeah, as that, at that time, newspapers were just starting to shrink. The internet was coming
Right.
into play and it was impacting papers and it was impacting staffs, and there were fewer people on staffs, and so the workload in each individual person became more. So you weren't just when I started out, you had one
You
specialty
had your niche.
suit.
Yeah.
By the time I left New Mexico in 2010 to come to Sarasota, I had worn a lot of hats. I've been investigative reporter, I've been a features reporter, I've been a dance critic, I've been a food critic. I even at one point wrote a column, a dubious column called Single in the City.
Where's your HBO special, Carrie?
It was about trying to date in Albuquerque. Yeah. So yeah, so by the time I came to Sarasota, I had quite a bit of experience in a lot of different areas.
I'd love to ask you about specifically critical writing, whether it's dance, food, whatever, because in this age of the internet where everyone can comment or throw their opinion out without second thought, that's not true criticism. So when you're in the mode, when you have to switch your brain into the mode of writing critically about something, but for an audience, are you informing? Are you trying to persuade? Like what's the process of writing as a critic, but not just like as an online troll hater, right? Which is easy, which is just reactionary. There's actual, when you are reviewing or being a critic, you have to take it in, digest, consider. There's a lot of work that goes into that. And then what is the goal of your final result there in terms of being a critic?
I'll start with talking about being a critic because I started as a dance critic and a food critic. And it has similarities to being an opinion writer, but there's a little bit of nuance there. But am always someone who has felt very strongly that you are not entitled to be a critic until you have a body of knowledge about what you're going to be writing about.
Yeah.
It really bothers me when publications put somebody, allow somebody to go review a dance performance. And I mean, they may know the ballet terms, they may know pirouette, they may know, brise ballet, but I don't ever use any of those terms in my dance criticism because to the general reader, they aren't going to know what that is. So for me to be a critic, I have to feel like I have a foundation in what I'm talking about. So I've now, at this point in my life, seen hundreds, if not thousands, of performances. I've seen the traditional story of LA Times many, many times. I've seen different companies many times. So I have some historical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I have technical knowledge of dance,
Mm-hmm.
what's required. And so my idea when I'm doing criticism is to educate people in some ways, to give them an idea of what they would have seen if they were at the performance. I don't like criticism that just kind of tells you a narrative of exactly what happened, that I'm trying to capture something of what the performance stirred in me,
Yeah.
and at the same time to maybe bring some things to people that they weren't aware of or didn't understand, or brought another level of thinking to their own reaction to the performance. I'm never trying to convince somebody to think the way that I think. And that goes for my opinion pieces as well. People say, oh, well, you're an opinion writer. Of course, you want everyone to agree with you. And in fact, I mean, it's lovely when they do agree with me. But what I really want them to do is think more deeply about what they think.
Hmm.
And the same thing with opinion writing. I'm not the kind of opinion writer who just sits down and off the top of my head spouts off on some topic.
Yeah.
People who've read my column know they're very researched. I
Yes.
do a lot of work to feel like I'm knowledgeable enough to have an opinion.
Right.
And really, I just want people to, I mean, they may read it and go, "Well, I feel completely different about that. And because you said this makes me even more feel that way." But they may also read it and go, "Well, gee, I never thought of it that way. And maybe I better think about that a little more."
Yeah.
So yeah, my goal was never to, I mean, a woman wrote me the other day, fortunately not about my review, but about somebody else's review. I went to see this show because it got a very positive review and it was terrible. It was amateurish. I wrote her back and said, well, perhaps you shouldn't base your attendance on a single review, because everybody, I don't know if I can say this.
Of course you can.
The saying is, opinions are like assholes, everyone has.
Yes.
So, yeah, I don't think that I think I'm often more well researched than the average Joe. So,
Yeah.
I've done more work to substantiate my opinion, but I never feel like I'm right and you're wrong.
Hmm. Is that a pretty common thing? Maybe less as maybe as a critic too. You mentioned someone writing in. Does that happen a lot? Is it a conversation with the readership?
But being a columnist is totally different than being a news reporter. I was a news reporter for the vast majority of, or have been for the vast majority of my career. And, as a reporter, if you have regular subscribers, they recognize your name. And if you're covering an area that they particularly like or read regularly, they may occasionally write to you and say, I love that piece, or
Yeah.
thanks, or whatever. As a columnist, you get inundated
Wow.
with mail. And when I took over the lead columnist position at the Herald Tribune, in my very first column, I said, I promise to answer anybody who reaches out, whether by email, phone, text, whatever. And to this day, my email and my cell phone number run at the end of every column,
Wow.
which nobody else does, and everybody thinks I'm an idiot. I actually think it's developed my audience
Hmm.
because, yes, I have established a relationship with a lot of regular readers, and they write to me regularly. I do write back always thoughtfully. Even I don't just write back and say, thanks for your feedback. It's not a standard reply.
Yeah.
And even when I get really harsh, sometimes even threatening email,
Oh my goodness.
I do try to write back. And it's been a very interesting process to see what happens when you do that, because you may get a very nasty email. And if you write back politely and try to show them where you were coming from and respect their opinion, it's remarkable how many times they will write back and say, I shouldn't have sent that. It was
Wow.
in haste, or, oh, I see a little bit more how I mean, they tend to take it down a level. And sometimes I'll have an exchange of 5 or 6 emails with someone
Wow.
on a single column. So yeah, being a columnist, also as a columnist, your picture appears in the paper.
Yeah.
You're in the same place every time when they look for you. So, and you're writing, as you know, in column writing, you can use the I word. I mean, and you don't have to be fair and balanced. I mean, you do have to be, I think you have to be factual and you have to be fair,
Yes.
but you can be subjective. I mean,
Yes.
why you're writing it is to give your opinion. I think that develops a relationship with the reader where a lot of my readers feel like they know me. I have people come up to me on the street all the time, Carrie, and they come and give me a big hug, and I'm like scrambling. And then they'll say their name, and I'll be like, oh, of course, we've had tons of email exchanges, but I don't know them by name.
Wow.
And they feel like they know me. So it is very different to be a columnist, for sure.
Carrie, I want to pivot into talking about facing mental illness, which is this amazing project that you've been spearheading the last few years. I just want to give you a little runway here to kind of talk about why you started it, the various components of it. I know there's visual art, there's a podcast, there's a Substack. So I'd love for you just to kind of set the stage for what is facing mental illness, why you brought it into being, and then we'll dig a bit more into how it's been impacting people and the value of storytelling in that mode. But yeah, just what is facing mental illness, where did it come from, and what are the components?
Sure. So, like many people who become involved in the mental health world as advocates, my catalyst was personal. And I have a son, as you know.
Oh yeah. He was in one of my acting classes. It was awesome.
He developed at the age of about 22 a severe mental health condition. And that really changed my life because I had no experience of that.
Yeah. And I know I just asked you this gigantic question, but this is, I think, an important point. You just said that Keaton developed this at age 22. I think there's so much, I think, misconception about how mental illnesses operate, where they come from, how they can manifest. Would you talk, whatever you're comfortable with, at age 22, how does something like that suddenly appear?
Well, in Keaton's case, I would have to say, although the mental health aspect of it didn't appear in a crisis kind of way
Right.
until 22, which is often the age when things come to the fore. But Keaton always had some challenge. He was diagnosed with a not necessarily rare, but very unheard of condition that's called velocardiofacial syndrome. And it has to do with a genetic chromosomal abnormality.
Yeah.
And it can have all kinds of impacts from physical to mental. And he had some learning disabilities. And so his childhood it wasn't like, oh, everything was perfect until he was 22 and
Right.
then all of a sudden there was a crash and burn. I mean, he definitely had areas where he was cognitively very challenged, and then other areas like music where he
He's
was,
brilliant. Yeah.
although he was never diagnosed with autism and he doesn't technically have autism, people today would probably see him as somewhere on the spectrum,
Right.
but that was long before people started even talking about
Yeah.
spectrum.
Yeah.
So of course, in hindsight, when you look back, you say, oh, well, maybe there was this little red flag there, and this, maybe this had something to do. But the crisis point came when he went off to music school in Boston, and
Yeah.
stressful situation, which is often a catalyst as well. And that's the age when it tends to happen with young men is, late teens, early 20s. So anyway, that was very significant. It was very difficult time of our
Yeah.
lives. I'm condensing a whole lot of years here, but it was very challenging. It happened when we were living in New Mexico, and then I moved to Florida. Eventually brought Keaton to Florida, not realizing Florida was like last in the nation for mental health services.
Yeah.
And had a terrible time getting him what he needed to help in his recovery, and thinking, my gosh, I'm an educated person with enough financial means to have insurance and I'm a reporter, for God's sake, so I know how to research things, and I can't get him what he needs.
Yeah.
And so I ended up writing a big piece for the Herald Tribune that was called The S Word, the Stigma of Schizophrenia.
Mm.
And at that time, I had a very hard time finding any other families who would talk to me or be photographed.
Yeah.
I ended up getting a young man with a schizophrenia diagnosis was an incredible artist who did illustrations for the piece. And long story short, that piece won a national media award. And it led to me applying to the Carter Center for Mental Health Journalism, which is a program started by Rosalind Carter that provides fellowships for journalists to do big mental health projects in their own communities. So I ended up receiving one of these awards, which was just miracle. It's like 10 people in the whole US. So that was wonderful. And came back to Sarasota and conceived of this project called Facing Mental Illness. And for those who aren't familiar with it, it is spelled FACE, FACE, as in face, facing mental illness,
Yeah.
because the project was kind of twofold. One part was that each week in the paper, I would write a profile of someone in recovery from some kind of mental health challenge. And that was a wide range from general anxiety to schizophrenia to bipolar to OCD. And so each week in the paper for a whole year, there was someone's story. And then all of those people and plus some other people were anyone with a mental health condition was invited to these open public art workshops that I held where we had all kinds of art supplies, and they were asked to create a self-portrait that somehow put into their self-portrait how they felt about their mental health challenges or how they experienced them. So over the course of the year, we're having these workshops, we're telling these stories weekly in the paper, and we're also doing like panel discussions with mental health people in town and bringing in guest speakers on issues of mental health. And it all culminated with a big art show with all of the pieces that hung in our main library here in Sarasota for a month. And then eventually stories and art from the project became a book and also a documentary film that was in the 2017 Sarasota Film Festival. So that's how the project, I mean, that was the main part, the
Yeah.
main project. I sort of thought that was going to be the end of it when that fellowship ended. And I went back to my column writing, and I was writing 3 times a week. So I really didn't have a lot of time to do anything else. And then at the end of 2020, I left full-time staff at the Herald Tribune, and I started my Substack of the same name, Facing Mental Illness, and started doing the same kind of, not the art component, but just doing the stories with people with lived experience. And then the pandemic hit, and podcasts, as you know, thing.
Took off.
And as I said earlier, one of the things I've loved about my career is that I don't have to speak.
Right, exactly.
But I had another friend who was also a mental health advocate, had personal experience with her children, and she didn't know anything about doing a podcast either. But between the two of us, we figured out how to do it and started interviewing people eventually from all around the country and doing the stories both in the podcast form and the written form so that people could access either way. So did that for a couple of years. And then most recently, we've done another art project, which was putting together partners, one being a professional artist and the other being someone with lived experience.
Oh, cool.
And the project was called Common Ground. And so these two people came together and they formed a relationship and spent a lot of time talking about what commonalities they had in terms of what mental health challenges they'd had over the course of their lifetime. Some of them diagnosed, some of them not diagnosed. And then they collaboratively created a piece of art that shared their commonalities.
Oh, that is really cool.
And that show just actually it's ending this weekend. It's been up for a month, and that was smaller scale. We had less people participating, but was also, as was my first project, the idea is to normalize the fact that we all have mental health challenges.
Yeah.
We all lie somewhere on a spectrum of mental wellness or mental unwellness. And it changes over the course of our lifetimes. It changes from year to year or day to day. So the whole idea is to still try to eliminate that idea that someone with a mental health condition is other.
Yeah.
That it's us and them. And it's really just all of us struggling with what it is to be human.
Yeah. All of these projects Carrie is mentioning and her websites and links in the book, I will put all links to all of those in the show summary. So you can go check out the book or get on her Substack. All of that will be in the summary. Talk about some of the impact you saw, Carrie, from combining artists with people with lived experience? What was the impact on both of them? And as you put all these stories out, I remember seeing the big double page spread in the paper, right? This comes back to the whole purpose of this podcast, which is storytelling. Why do you think a piece of art or someone simply is telling their story and having it publicized, why is that so impactful, especially on a civilian population who doesn't have the information?
My whole career has been about telling stories, whether even before I was a journalist, when I was dancing, it was about telling stories because I so strongly believe that stories are how we learn from each other best. I can write a story that has tons of statistics and numbers in it and a data chart, and no one is ever going to talk to me about that story again.
Yeah.
But a story that I wrote 10 years ago about a friend of mine who is 86 years old and healthy and decided to end her life by not eating and drinking, people still come up to me on the street here and talk to me about that story. So it's stories about people that really impact other people and that, again, make them think, make them consider, put themselves in those shoes. So I feel like because I have somewhat of a gift for storytelling, that that's a way that I can really have an impression, leave an impression, do good things with my work. The other thing that I've seen especially now this is about my mental health work, that telling these stories not only educates other people, but the transformation in some of the people who told their stories.
Right.
So when I told you when I did that first big mental health story, I couldn't get anyone to come forward. I couldn't get anyone who would have their picture taken. So the Facing Mental Illness Project, the fellowship project, I set myself a really high bar at the beginning, which was if you're going to participate, you have to use your real name and you have to be photographed. Now, if you know anything about the mental health world and how these people even self-stigmatize because they've been so
Yeah.
ostracized,
Yeah.
you know, that was a high bar. And when I started the project, remember, this is a year-long project, and when I started the project, I had like 6 people that agreed to tell their stories. And I was like, oh my God, it's gonna work. Because how am I going to find? We ended up with 52. We did
Wow.
one every single week. And what happened was, well, there was a little tagline at the end of each profile, and it said, "Do you have a story to share? Contact Carrie." And what happened is it became the snowball. The more people told their stories, the more people wanted to tell their stories
Yeah.
and wanted to be open and vulnerable. And in some cases, and I have remained friends with a good number of the people that were in that first project. In some cases, I saw it really, I mean, I'm not taking credit for it. I'm giving credit to them. It really turned things around for them. They felt for the first time since the onset of their illness that they were valued and that they were appreciated and that they didn't have to hide and that they had gifts to share. And a couple of the people I had just seen really them blossom because of that. When we did the documentary film at the film festival, one of the things I insisted on is we got to have a red carpet because I wanted them all to be able to
Oh, yeah.
and and they did, and it was just such a powerful, feel-good thing for all of us to realize that every single person has something to offer us, something we can learn from, and that to me is the power of storytelling and why I so believe it. A lot of people come to me and say, "I would like to share my story with my kids or, whatever, but I'm not a writer." I'm like, doesn't matter. Do it in whatever format you can. Make a videotape, draw pictures, whatever you enjoy doing, but share your story with at least your family, if not a broader audience, because I feel like that's just so incredibly important.
Carrie, there was as we were chatting before too, you mentioned a similar project that NPR was doing and we had to look it up because we neither of us could remember it right away, but it was called StoryCorps, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Name of it. I don't know if I think it's still going on. The local state NPR station here used to run it, but I don't think they're running it anymore. But basically, they had these booths where you could set up and you would bring in, it could be a relative or a friend or whatever, and talk about something in your life that was kind of a monumental thing or a turning point or that had an impact on you. And it was storytelling, not formal, not, not somebody interviewing, but just two friends or two relatives, sharing something that was impactful from their lives. And I would stop the car and listen. Sometimes I had tears running down my cheeks.
Yeah.
I just think sharing our stories is, and, whatever format it's in, whether it's in dance, whether it's in journalism, whether it's in the theater, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's the stories that move you. It's the stories that connect you.
But I typically wrap up by asking questions about advice, but you had let me know that advice was not one of your favorite things, but you did say that a question you ponder sometimes is, what are the things that you would wish you'd known? And that could be a way to share something with any other aspiring dancer or journalist or columnist out there. What are some things you would wish you had known?
Well, I do not live my life in regret. I've had a wonderful, amazing career and a wonderful life. I have an incredible family. So I don't do a lot of looking back and saying, "Oh, I wish I had known this," or I could have. I mean, obviously, we always could have done certain things
Right.
better. But you had asked me, what advice were you given, in your career that was really important to you? And I'm sure that I was given a lot of advice over the years. I've had one person who's been kind of a mentor. He was my editor at the New York Times when I was there, and we have stayed in touch. But it isn't any particular piece of advice as much as just being there,
Hmm.
being a mentor. But what I did tell you is that there is one thing that I wish I would have been told
Okay, great.
when I was younger. As I said, I was a very shy child. I was pretty timid. And the one thing that, looking back on my career, that I wish I could have done and that I would say to somebody who's starting out is, be brave.
Hmm.
There are times that I look back on as if I just hadn't been so self-doubting and undermining and unconfident, if I just said, I'm going to try this. And whether it was a new column or a new job or something as small as, I'm going to take a chance and try to write the story in a totally different way,
Yeah.
and it might work and it might not work. But I wish that I had been a bit braver, a bit willing to be vulnerable and let myself out there. And I think that's something I definitely learned as I went along. And of course, all the mental health work, which involved a lot of personal revealing,
Yeah.
taught me that. And the column, this is true as well. I write a lot in my column about personal stuff. And sometimes people say to me, like, do you have no boundaries? But in a way, I really don't, because I feel like allowing yourself to be vulnerable, allowing yourself to put something out there that humanizes you is a great way to connect with people.
Great.
So I would say, be brave. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable.
I love the connection that you're making between bravery and vulnerability. On the surface, that sounds counterintuitive, but
Right. Because
that's
we think of
fantastic.
brave as sort of, yeah, strong and just bully your way through. That's not what I mean by being brave.
Yeah.
Being brave, I mean by doing the thing you're afraid to do.
Yeah. Great. Carrie, last minute here, just a spotlight for you. What do you have going on? How can people find you and find your projects? Where should they go to learn more?
Well, at the moment, I'm still writing for the Herald Tribune once a week. It comes out online on Fridays and in the print paper if you happen to be a dinosaur on Sundays. As you mentioned, I have the Facing Mount Wellness Substack. I'm we're kind of at a little hiatus at the moment because we just finished this art project and we haven't resumed the podcast. I have been in talks with a dance company, a contemporary dance company here in Sarasota,
Ooh.
about potentially doing some kind of mental health dance project
Oh,
with them.
wow.
So that's a thought. As you know, since you published it, my book is out there, and I have applied to a number of writing fellowships that I hope to do a residency somewhere to take on my magnum opus, I hope, which is going to be my memoir of all these stories.
Carrie, thank you again so much for your time today and for what ended up being wonderful advice to go be brave. The Page and Stage podcast is built with Alitu, the all-in-one podcasting app created by the amazing team over at thepodcasthost.com. You can learn more about all my guests and access their websites and projects in the episode summaries. If you enjoyed and found value in this podcast, please tell at least one other person. Word of mouth has always been and will always be the best marketing tool in the world. Thank you for listening. And until next time, I'm Jason Cannon, and I cannot wait to hear your story.